I know that there are some Jewish mothers out there and some physicians who are wondering what I'm doing here. I have to say, after several days of resting and hydrating, it wasn't working. So I thought I'd come and see my favorite congregants and see if I could cheer the virus out of me. I don't think that's working either, so after my sermon, I'm going to excuse myself and go back home. The topic of today's sermon is Jewish identity. Some of you may find some of the questions I raise to be provocative, and that's okay. I'm intentionally playing devil's advocate because I want to open up a conversation about Jewish identity, and I think one way to do that is to look at the extreme ends of that conversation. It's important because, as Dr. Chaye Sarah of Harvard University says, the people who get to decide who is a Jew get to decide what Judaism is. I'll teach you a little bit of a period of history in Israel. There are a group of Jews from India. They call themselves B'nai Israel. And according to their tradition, they are one of the lost tribes. When the kingdom split in two, the northern kingdom was scattered into exile earlier than the southern kingdom, and those 10 tribes, we don't exactly know where they ended up. And B'nai Israel says, we ended up in India. We are Jewish. And in 1948, B'nai Israel started immigrating from India to the new state. But in 1960, the chief Sephardic rabbi said, B'nai Israel can't marry other Jews. They're not Jewish enough. Now, for some reason, the international media picked up the story, and something that might have faded away into oblivion got a lot of attention. In a bizarre turn of events, Egypt offered asylum to B'nai Israel. They didn't take them up on it. But the Israeli government and the Israeli people began to advocate strongly, and eventually the rabbinut gave in, and B'nai Israel are now a normative part of Israeli society and the Jewish community as a whole. So here's my question. If a group of Jews has been practicing some form of Judaism for 2,000 years, now keep in mind when they left, if they are descendants of the 10 lost tribes, the temple was alive and well in the southern kingdom. So they didn't have rabbinic Judaism. They weren't there when the shift was made from temple Judaism and sacrifice to one of Torah study and Jewish law. But they've been practicing some form of Judaism for 2,000 years, and in the 18th century, when they finally made contact again with the global Jewish community, started practicing normative Judaism, at what point do you say, look, these guys are Jewish. They don't need to go through an Orthodox conversion? What's the standard for conversion in the conservative world? Or what makes you a Jew? You need to be born from a Jewish mother, not a Jewish father. And if that's not the case, then you need to convert. And the way you convert is to appear before a Beit Din. That's 3 rabbis. And you say before the Beit Din, I'm taking on God's commandments. Then you immerse in a mikveh. And if you happen to be male, if you're not circumcised, you need to be circumcised. Or if you are already circumcised, they do hatafat dam brit. They take a ceremonial drop of blood from the penis in order to enter that Jewish male into the covenant. You can imagine that this sets up some challenges for people. I mean, imagine you grew up in a Reform synagogue. Your father is Jewish, your mother is not. You went through a bar mitzvah, the ceremony where you say, I'm taking upon myself the mitzvot. You've married a Jewish woman, you're raising Jewish children, you're studying Torah, you're somewhat keeping kosher, somewhat keeping Shabbat, like many conservative Jews. Now you leave your Reform congregation, you want to join a conservative congregation, and they say to you, well, you're not Jewish. What does that mean? Let's go through a few scenarios about Jewish identity. The convert. The person who's going through the conversion process stands before a Beit Din and says, I'm taking on the mitzvot. Well, to what extent? Okay, let's say keeping kosher. Does that mean they won't eat pork and shellfish? Does that mean they'll keep a kosher kitchen in their home, but they will eat what they like when they're out? Or does that mean, no, I'm strictly kosher. I will only eat strictly kosher food? But how does that make sense if the person who's born Jewish sitting next to them in the synagogue will chew on pork barbecue, right? Right? It does. Why are they held to a higher standard in their practice? It's an interesting question to play with. What about cases in Israel? There are Jews who are Jewish enough to have the word Jew on their Israeli passport, and they're Jewish enough to die in the Israeli army, but they're not Jewish enough, according to the Rabbanut, to be buried in a Jewish cemetery. This really happened. This happened with a young man named Lev Polov. He was from the former Soviet Union, and he immigrated to Israel by the law of return. That means if you have at least one Jewish grandparent, you can immigrate to Israel. So he did, and he was killed, unfortunately, by a terrorist attack at a military checkpoint. So he died defending the Jewish state, and eventually they agreed to bury him at the edge of a Jewish cemetery. Now we click our tongues, but what about groups that we consider to be fringe? Marranos, Jews whose families were converted during the Inquisition in Spain, and many of whom are practicing Catholicism, yet somehow still have some claim to Jewish identity and have some Jewish customs in their families. Karaites, people who also never took on a rabbinic form of Judaism, but have really continued a more literal interpretation of the Torah, not a rabbinic one. Or what about Eitz Chaim around the corner, Messianic Jews? Right? Do we feel comfortable inviting them to join us in our community Seder? Now here I am being provocative, right? Because there is a difference, right? They believe that Jesus is a God incarnate and they believe in a Trinity, and that's pretty different from the beliefs that I think most of us in this room hold. But I can't be 100% sure. What about taking Judaism through genetics? There are Jewish diseases, right? Tay-Sachs, it's in our genes. Or there are Jewish markers in genes for the Kohen. There's a priestly gene. But are we comfortable identifying Judaism with genetics after the Holocaust? I don't know. It's an interesting question to raise. I'll tell you how I've seen some of Jewish identity play out as a rabbi. In the synagogue in Atlanta, one Friday evening, a police officer in uniform came into the synagogue. And the gabbai stopped the service and said, "Is everything all right, officer?" And the man was a little bewildered, and he said, "Well, everything's fine, but it's my father's yard site, and I was on my way home, and I didn't have time to change my clothing." And the gabbai's response was, "Oh, I guess I just don't think of policemen as being Jewish." You can imagine how comfortable and welcoming that statement was. And in that same synagogue, when it came time to count a minyan, we would ask people, some of us would ask people, who were Latino or black or had blonde hair and a cute button nose, I'm sorry, we just need to confirm, are there 10 Jews in the room? Are you Jewish? We were absolutely halakhically correct. You need a minyan to say Kaddish. But we were setting a barrier between the us and them. Now in San Francisco, because it's a very ethnically diverse Jewish community, they didn't ask people about their Jewish identity based on race. They asked people about their Jewish identity based on how comfortable they looked handling the prayer book. But you can imagine the poor person who's come for the once-a-year anniversary of a parent's death and who really doesn't feel comfortable with the prayer book, but they've been Jewish all their lives. And instead of us saying, "We're so glad you came to honor their memory with us today. How else can we comfort you?" we say, "Are you Jewish enough?" It's not welcoming. So why are we setting this barrier to entry so high? What are we protecting ourselves from? If you look at the Talmud, the way conversion was done actually had a little room for flexibility. There's a conversation in Masechet Yibamot, and they're talking about, do you need to both be circumcised and go into the mikveh? And Rebbe Eliezer says, well, look, if you're circumcised, you don't need to go through the mikveh process. So that would take the Jew who's from patrilineal descent, right, the one who grew up in the Reform or Reconstructionist movement, his whole life he's been Jewish, and when he comes to the conservative synagogue and joins, we say, come on board. You've been Jewish your whole life. That would allow us to do that. Rabbi Yehoshua says, well, you need to go to the mikveh, you need to go through that spiritual affirmation process, but you don't need circumcision. Why? It's a lot to ask of someone. When you're an adult being circumcised, it's not a minor thing, and it's usually not covered by insurance. It's an elective surgery. It's expensive. That's a big thing to request. So what does a rabbi do in this scenario where this couple's fallen in love? She's Jewish, he's not, and he says, I love your customs, I'm studying Torah, I'm keeping kosher. If I'm blessed with sons, I'll circumcise them, but Rabbi, this has been my body my whole life, I just don't want to do this. I have to tell him, then you can't be Jewish. As a conservative rabbi, I believe passionately in the tension between tradition and change, which means I'm duty-bound to two things. The first is to uphold our current standards of defining Jewish identity and the process that we go through in order to become Jewish. But the second thing I'm responsible to do is examine that from time to time and say, is it still serving the Jewish people well? Are we missing welcoming people into the fold that would be wonderful members of our community? I really believe passionately in the power of Judaism. I've dedicated my whole life to it. I think that the depth of our text has something to offer the world to explain its complexities. I think our daily spiritual practices are uplifting. But some of our customs around Jewish identity are not welcoming. They are barriers to entry. And this week in Florida, through the Federation of Jewish Men's Club, a number of rabbis were invited to come and have a deeper discussion, a more profound discussion about what is Jewish identity. What should we be doing as a movement to be inclusive? Now, unfortunately, I missed the meeting because I was ill, but I did get to see some of the social media and read the articles. It was a very interesting conversation, and I think it may grow a louder voice in the conservative movement, and that's why I'm bringing the conversation into the room today, because you as conservative Jews are part of that conversation. You should be a voice in saying, well, here's what I think Jewish identity means. Here's what I think is important in building our community. I'll close with one more story. When Adiv and I were living in Jerusalem, we lived near the Shuk. And there was this little tiny Ethiopian restaurant in an alley. And the food always smelled so good. But they didn't have a certificate in the window that authenticated the food as kosher. One day, Adiv and I walked into the shop, and we found the proprietor. It wasn't hard. It had about 4 tables. It was a little family place. And we said, is your restaurant kosher? He said, of course it's kosher. He said, but you don't have a certificate. And he looked at us like we were from Mars, and he said, I'm black. I'm Ethiopian. The Rabbanut won't give me a certificate. And so this man who had made a very dangerous journey from Ethiopia, it is not an easy aliyah, not like nefesh b'nefesh, right? He'd made a very dangerous journey to Israel. He then lived an immigrant's life, learning a new language, trying to scratch by and build up a life for his family. And by the way, he had pictures on the walls of young people in Israeli uniforms, probably his children, couldn't get a certificate of kashrut from the Rabbanut. So my decision and Adiv's decision was, this man is Jewish enough. And we ate in his restaurant. Shabbat Shalom.